Now we're studying the path of truth, and we were looking at freedom when we discussed the Emperor, and now we're looking at involvement, this association with Pluto in our outer planets kind of aspect of this study indicates that the Hierophant is a figure of power and a bringer of truth, insofar as we become involved in order to discover these mysteries. Now, Hierophant is a Greek word which literally means to show what is holy. So you have two things there. You have what is holy and showing. This word Hierophant has been used in some tarot decks by the name Pope. So that gives you a clue insofar as it's somewhat like the Pope, but actually not the Pope. It's not doing it the way the Pope does it. The Hierophant is an unusual word. We had to learn this word newly in order to study the tarot, because it's meant to put forward the idea that this is not the Pope, this is the Hierophant. So we're looking at a distinction between a religious figure, on the one hand, the Pope, who's in command of a major political institution, which has a spiritual program, and comparing that to the Hierophant, whose very purpose of existence was to show people what is holy, revealing sacred mysteries, arcane principles. In other words, the what and the how and the why of sacredness. And of course the Pope itself, as a position, has that function to some extent, but only to his followers. Now, the Hierophant is a more esoteric principle, and this is the principle that we're studying. It's not limited to somebody with a title. That's the whole point. Each of us individually has within us this archetype. All of these tarot archetypes, all of these astrological archetypes, every archetype there is, each of them resonates within us because everything is connected. And if you tune in a certain mental attitude, you can resonate with all and anything. And so the Hierophant is within us. And it is within us our relationship with guidance of the spiritual kind, spiritual guidance. So within us is the appetite to find a spiritual guide. Within us is the appetite to become a spiritual guide. And they're not different from one another in essence. Just one is looking out and the other is looking inwardly. And what we're looking for is that which we consider to be sacredness. And this is different for each person. Sacredness has a generality. Of course it does. It's a very profound binding force of the community, whatever community you're part of. What binds it together is not only geographical importance, and it is also economic importance, it is also morality and customs, and yet what binds the community most strongly together is its sense of what is sacred. That which is sacred is the most profound glue that holds together a community. And we see this in different parts of the world, the most obvious perhaps being the Arab nations that are bound together as much by their cultural identity as being Arabs as their religious identity as being Muslim. And we see how the linking up happens there between a generic kind of ancestral cultural input on the one hand, but also on the other hand, what they're doing with the mind, the belief, and the practices on the other. And very often they're similar. and at least related. But there are more Muslims than there are Arabs, and these Muslims hold together as a group when push comes to shove. So we find that we're looking for something sacred which binds us into our community. And when we look deeply into what is our community, we get some clues about this. Our community is not simply our nation state, is it? Because within that there's a subsection, and you will find that the people within your social group tend to have a similar attitude to sacredness. And it's for us, as we tune into the energy of the Hierophant, is to be guided in that. Now, the whole principle of guidance is fraught with conflict, and that is because, I would suggest, priests over the millennia have abused their position of authority, and therefore people rather doubt the authenticity and the sincerity of a spiritual teacher. And so a lot of people throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, because this priest is corrupt, his religion is corrupt, because that teaching is biased, the whole of spiritual teachings are biased and wrong. We throw out the baby with the bathwater. But there's a much wiser and more subtle understanding to bring, and this applies to astrology very much, is that, let's take this example, just because astrologers are not representing astrology very well, it doesn't mean astrology is nonsense, but it is dismissed by scientists and others because it just doesn't check out when people that haven't studied it properly try to present it to the world. But there is meaning within astrology, despite the fact that astrologers aren't very good at it. The same is true of priestly functions. There is meaning within sacredness and even religion to some extent, despite the fact that these principles are represented by those who've got an agenda. They're trying to persuade us that their way of being is right, specifically right for us, without saying, look, this is what I do, take it or leave it, make it up your own mind, have a look at other paths and see which suits you best, which I would suggest is a much more wholesome and healthy approach to this. However, that said, you can't go very far into the study of a sacred tradition without putting yourself under the tutelage of a guide. That's because these mysteries are mysterious, they're hidden, and they're written in metaphor very often, and you need a guide to show you the way. Now, it's inevitable, this is not something you can avoid. It is inevitable that when you find a guide, they will be somewhat corrupted. They will be somewhat persuasive, forcing you into their way of seeing things. That's not because of their badness particularly. It's just that's how it goes. There isn't anybody who actually gets it all right for everyone. It just doesn't exist. That's a fancy. That's like a child believing in Santa Claus. That's nonsense. When you meet a guide, you know for a fact that that guide has both light and shadow, because, how do you know this? Because they're breathing. Everyone who is breathing is subject to corruption. Every one of us. Has to be remembered. So, instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what we have to do is to take what the guide has to offer, which suits us. Now, there are two aspects of that we could say. We could say that a part of the guidance that we're given, the teachings that we're given, is good and will last us right through to the end. It's good stuff. We want it. It's a stepping stone towards our next level of spiritual unfoldment. It's good. However, part of it is not. Either it's wrong, or it's useless, or it's just not our thing. It's not good. Now, what we have to do is to learn how to filter. We have to filter out the charlatans. We have to filter out the unlearned ones. We have to filter out the ones that are simply inappropriate for our path. And that job of learning how to filter is the teaching of the guide. It's not the content of their spiritual path, their system, that matters quite as much. That's useful information. That's a model that you can think about and maybe use, maybe reject, maybe take part of. The spiritual teachings themselves, the explanation of the arcane principles themselves, some are useful, some are confusing, some are downright lies, actually. And that's all grist to the mill. You know, you can use that stuff. But the principal thing that you're trying to learn is to distinguish between that which is and that which is not central to your sense of sacredness and your spiritual path. Now, there is an aspect of involvement that we really do have to learn. Involvement itself has been described in the same sense, that some of it is good and some of it is not, and we learn how to filter. That's what involvement's all around. With your Pluto transits, for example, some of it is the birthing of the new, some of it is the death of the old. You see how Pluto speaks to this very question of filtering out that which is and that which is not wholesome and healthy and appropriate for us. This is true of any involvement. We get involved in something and we take on the light of that thing and we take on the shadow of that thing. It's inevitable. That is what involvement is. Take a very perfect example when you get involved with people in a group in some way or in a relationship. You will learn from them new ways of being bigger and more exultant in your being and more expressive of yourself. You'll learn skills and you'll learn ideas and you'll be shown ways of perception and how to see things differently. All of that will sponsor your growth. However, you will also take on some of their habits. Most groups have got habits. Some are drugs, alcohol, or coffee mornings, or dope, or ayahuasca, or whatever. And that might well start out as a wonderful first experience, but there's this entropy working which tends to make an exciting new experience less so next time, even less so the third time, and diminishing all of the time until you actually end up taking these drugs, coffee or ayahuasca, more frequently than is appropriate for the high consciousness that it can give you. Even coffee, even chocolate. They have an effect upon us that awakens consciousness as long as we keep the dosage in proper terms. And this applies to people. When we're actually mixing with people, a little is good, a lot might turn into a habit. So our involvements with people or with ideas, beliefs, practices, like if you take on a spiritual practice and you do that practice all of the time for decades, your involvement in that practice will certainly bring you something well worthwhile. However, it will cost you something as well. For a short period, in my period of inquiry, I practiced the way of being a Muslim. I was in Turkey and I went to the prayers and I did them 5 times a day and I got involved and I wanted to find out what that was about. And after I had finished that, I was leaving Turkey and I spent some time in the chapel at the airport, and which was devoid of culture. It's an airport. And so I moved out of the culture of Turkey without moving into the culture of England at that time. And I was in this neutral space, and my mind was shaped to some extent by the neutrality of the chapel. And I noticed that it was no longer big as it used to be, and it was actually blinkered. My mind had become sharp in a particular attitude of being. And as I left Turkey and I left Islam, my mind took a different dimension. Now, I'm not making a judgment about which is better or which is worse. I'm just saying that the Muslim practices that I used sharpened my mind but blinkered it, whereas the wide-ranging interest of an intelligent Westerner opens the mind and makes it less focused. Breadth and depth are at interplay here. Now, when we're looking at the Hierophant card and our relationship with guidance, we have this to deal with. We must become involved with a guide. Now, that might be a person. That might be a lineage of teaching. It might be a book. But it has to be telling you how to do things differently. The how and the why of understanding your sacredness differently. That's what we're talking about, spiritual guidance. And you must know that your main job is to filter out what works for you from what doesn't. As you do that, you become more discriminating about who you are and what works for you in life. And you find yourself embellishing what you have been told and spinning it a little bit to take into account what you have experienced. You try and reconcile the theory with the practice, the spiritual teachings with your experience of sacredness. And as you try and reconcile those two things, your own voice starts to be a part of the formula, and you say things in your way. And little by little, you become a presenter of the spiritual understandings that you have. In other words, you become a guide, having followed a guide. And if you haven't followed a guide, then I don't think you can be a guide. There is something about guidance itself that you have to learn how to form right relationship with your students and so on. So when you become a guide, then you're a spiritual teacher of sorts. Now, you don't have to call yourself that or even think of yourself as that. But if you're having a conversation in a cafe or a pub and somebody says, what's your ideas on sacredness and spirituality, and you explain it in a way that they haven't heard before, then you're fulfilling the function of priesthood. You're awakening someone to the choice that then they have between what is and what is not sacred for them. So each of us who is on a spiritual path become, to some extent, teachers. And then we open up the formula, which I'm focusing on often in my work, of the threefold skill set, attitude of being of any teacher, any guide, and that is entertainer, teacher, and priest. Those three things are three aspects of the principle of spiritual guidance. To be an entertainer is necessary because otherwise you cannot win the attention of the special interest group you're trying to relate to. You want to get a group together, even if it's only an individual really, but you have to get their attention. And without their attention, nothing. You've got no line of communication open. To get somebody's attention, you entertain. That's how it works. And that entertainment might be an interesting idea, a conversation which is interesting, or it might be musical, or it might be some other form, it might be humour. There's ways in which we can entertain people to draw them into our field of influence. And then we have to teach them. In other words, explain that which we know how to do, which they don't know how to do, or how to think, or so on. We have to explain what we know so that they know it. We have to teach. And then we are aware of the atmosphere with which we do that. And that has to be graceful, filled with grace, in order for it to be inspirational. And that's the priestly function, to raise people into a sense of sacredness. And if you do this in a way where you feel you're enacting sacredness within yourself, as you explain something to others, even as you entertain, then the atmosphere that you have within yourself is the teaching. They'll resonate with the atmosphere. It doesn't go in through the mind. We don't teach people through that mental construct. We actually teach people through holding an atmosphere and offering that atmosphere to them on the level of resonance. We keep the mind, my mind and your mind, involved in thinking by explaining philosophy and principles and so on, to stop it from getting in the way of this feeling of atmosphere. Now, that feeling of atmosphere is equivalent to where we go in meditation. And the central pole of being a spiritual person, especially a spiritual teacher, is meditation. Meditation means centering. And we are not centered typically, because the mind pulls us wherever its attention goes. The attention is a slave master. Wherever we put our attention, that's where we go. And the mind changes its focus of attention very rapidly indeed. It's like the wind blowing around. And meditation is a training to help learn to control what we do with the mind. And we begin by focusing the mind on breath. We just watch what's happening as we breathe, and we allow all the other thoughts to come and go, but we focus on the breath. And eventually, all the other thoughts, if you train yourself to be meditating frequently and well, all the other thoughts just don't have any traction then. They don't come. And you learn to find that state of being where you forget yourself. And when you forget yourself, then something can come in, which is not ego-centered. It's centered at a higher level of being, and awakens us to a sense of sacredness. And we move into that atmosphere associated with sacredness, which is Holy Spirit, And that's what you pass to someone else if you're trying to become priestly in your teachings. Now, this atmosphere of sacredness, which you can control through your breath, you can move into that state of Holy Spirit, that choice. When you learn to meditate, train yourself in meditation. And that resonates with anyone around who's looking for that intuitively. And they've come to you for guidance. Now, there isn't anything better than this. This is the only game in town. When that's what you want, you don't want anything else. That will do, and nothing else will do. And therefore you start to become where people have to come in order to get it. It's like a watering hole. And you hold that place, and you become the pole around which people move. You become the center. By centering yourself in meditation, you become the center of a group of people who are perhaps not quite as developed as you are in finding that center. And they find it much more readily when they're with you, because you know how to control the mind so that you can move into that centered place of being at will, and you become the center of your influence group. Now, that could be very small indeed. That might only be one or two people, but it could be huge. It could be millions in some cases. So we don't care about how large that group is. That's not important. What's important is that you use this facility of knowing there exists a position of the pole, and you can inhabit it with consciousness, knowing that it exists. When you do that, then you're fulfilling the function of the Hierophant. When you do that, you become involved with giving form to sacredness for other people. And that's a very influential position in life. And it carries with it tremendous depth of responsibility. there are many complaints rendered in the world against behaviours which seem to harm other people. If you assault another person, or you offend another person, or you steal their money, and all these things, all of these abuses against people are railed against in society. And yet the worst thing you can do to somebody, really, is to corrupt their mind, because the mind is the source of everything. And if you corrupt someone's mind, you've corrupted their life, all of it. And so when we become the central pole of our own beingness and those people that rotate around us, when we do this, then we've taken on the responsibility for shaping the minds of those people, which is very much more important than anything else, and subject to abuse at that level as well. So it's a challenge for us to learn how to be this way, which is pretty much inevitable when you're on any spiritual path. You become the influence in your social circle by doing that. And yet we have to make sure we do not succumb to the temptation of the abuses of spiritual authority, which we can see written in history. The various religious movements have all had corrupted leaders that have brought shame and embarrassment and guilt and horrible things to their religions. We must make sure we don't do that. And this is the essence of the Hierophant. Just make sure that your spiritual influence is pure and is good.